This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
You're welcome back into the conversation. It's still Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. My name is Stephen Imediegu, and for today's edition of Tech Now, we are speaking with Ade Atobatele, the CEO at Remarkable Ideas Limited, and we're talking about tech that is familiar. It's right there in your hands. It was disrupted a few weeks ago when internet services across Nigeria and some parts of Africa went down. Be internet. www. Your ability to access information at your fingertips. Now, while repairs are ongoing to restore the full capability of the undersea cables that were cut, the question of what options exist for users of the internet is something that has continued to come up, as well as the questions around what can be done in the future to prevent these sorts of interruptions to services from happening. And that's what Mr. Atobatele will attempt to speak with us on today. Mr. Atobatele, thank you for joining us on the conversation.
You're welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. To start with, we saw quite the interruption to internet and banking services in Nigeria last month when some undersea cables were cut. And at the time, we talked about it and we briefly touched on what sort of options are available to users on the internet now. I'm bringing this up because countries like Ghana, which were adversely affected, more heavily affected than Nigeria, are starting to look at other options for ensuring that their connection to the World Wide Web remains untouched. And one of the companies that you mentioned, or one of the opportunities that you mentioned, was Starlink. And I'm wondering if this is, dare I say it from this perspective, an affordable solution, and whether the decision of Ghana, and it's still very, very speculative really, whether Ghana's decision to look in that direction will spell a change in how we access the internet in this part of the world.
The usage of the internet comes in two main ways. Are you accessing somebody locally, or that is within your national borders, or are you accessing somebody that's outside your national borders? If I'm sending an email to you, then I'm actually within my national borders, and it should be quite easy for me to have an interconnect point between two providers, which means that the internet never went outside the country. If, however, I want to browse CNN, and CNN is sitting outside the country, and I'm going to have to go down one of those pipes. The third thing to consider is content dumps, like CDNs, what we call CDNs, which is cache dumps. So if you know that you're accessing a particular site or not, then you can cache that site locally. So when we come to talk about Ghana and anybody else, what we really need is a network of local internet points that ensure that traffic that is local doesn't go outside the country. Added to the fact that we can have CD cache data networks, then a lot of the traffic, even if it is outside the country, can also be residing locally. So that brings down a large percentage of the traffic that would otherwise go over an undersea cable or go up via the satellite. So yes, it is possible to start thinking about creating resilient networks that allow a large portion of the internet to stay local.
So that does make a lot of sense in terms of how far it would push our societies, especially African societies. And I wonder if this is not something that was considered prior to the decision to use undersea cables for, the internet access that takes us outside of our countries. Why is it something that we need to think of now? I mean, of course, we have seen interruptions to our internet, but most of the connection that we do is outside of our country's borders, outside of our continent. If we start to localize our internet access, or if we start to focus on ensuring that our local connections are stable, do we risk cutting ourselves off from the rest of the world?
Remember, we're not cutting ourselves off. What we're saying is that we're bringing local caches of external data to be localized, so we don't have to go as far as to access them. It also might be a sort of a lag of a minute or two in the caches being totally up to date. the other thing that we need to remember is that the majority of the traffic that goes over the internet in today's world is not educational, is not institutional, it's pure entertainment. Netflix takes up the majority of the bandwidth, and other streaming providers. So when we're talking about data that we're actually using on a daily basis, that is actually a minority of the data that moves across the internet. So if we couldn't get to Netflix, but we could get to CNN, is there such a bad thing?
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Exactly. So really, what we should be thinking about is caching the non-streaming part of the internet to be as near as possible. And when I say near, it doesn't have to be just in Nigeria. That cache could be in Ghana if we have a direct pipe to Ghana. In other words, this is a question of how do you interconnect your local points so that they cache that data, so you don't have to go through a satellite or an undersea pipe to get to where you're going. We do have those things in Nigeria. However, the regulator has not been very good at enforcing national security policies that would say that everybody that brings in a pipe, everybody that has access to those internet must, and I repeat, must connect to an interconnect point in Nigeria. That should be part of licensing. You cannot have a license unless you connect to not just your interconnect point, but a third-party interconnect point. It's a bit like NIBS, where all the banks have to connect to at least NIBS, and that after they've connected to NIBS, they're allowed to connect to multiple other exchanges. But there must be at least central point where all the data comes in and connects to those points. And the telcos have not been very good at making sure that this happens.
And once again, you did mention that this is something that the regulators should have focused on. Why do we skip such an important part of the process of protecting data? Because
we never had the situation where it became the country went down because we never had data. Now this is why we're having a conversation this morning. We've suddenly realized how interwoven the internet has become in our daily processes. So, and when it becomes that interwoven, it becomes a security issue. And that is why the regulator now needs to start thinking about how to enforce things that are already on its books. There's no need for any new laws. No need for, it's just really enforcement. If you bring a pipe in from the outside of the country, it must connect to at least one interconnect point. And that interconnect point cannot be one that you own.
All right. Well, that does make sense. And then I get the feeling that if we did have these interconnect points that are owned by countries, we will be talking about not just security, but is there a revenue angle to this conversation that could benefit governments?
Well, everything is taxable in Nigeria. Everything is taxable all over the world as long as it's commercial. But I don't think the revenue aspect is big. I think the effect to normal society, and I really do mean normal society, I couldn't buy electricity because of the internet being down. This thing affects ordinary people, and that's why it's a national security issue. It doesn't just affect the elite. Now we buy recharge, not buy recharge cards on the street or vendors on the road. We use our mobile phones to do the recharge. If we can't connect to the recharge, we can't make phone calls. It's a national security issue.
Definitely. Well, Mr. Atuobatele, thank you very much for the insight that you have provided on this conversation. We do hope that we will see changes, especially because this internet disruptions that we've experienced in this last few weeks have been very concerning. The loss of funds to businesses is not something that we can estimate in one breath. Our guest on the conversation is Ade Atuobatele, the CEO at Remarkable Ideas Limited. He joined us this morning to talk about the opportunities that Africa has to reset the conversation and address some of the hidden concerns as far as connections to the internet is concerned. Last month, there were disruptions to internet services across Nigeria and some parts of Africa when undersea cables in the Horn of Africa were damaged. Now, those repairs to these cables are still ongoing, and we have seen an improvement in the sort of internet services that we are receiving, but they continue to be repaired, and it's hoped that in the near future these repairs will be completed as soon as possible.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM.